The babies were born with glowing red eyes and no one could explain why. But when the village dug beneath the sacred tree, they uncovered what their ancestors tried to forget. This isn't just a curse, it's a meal the devil never finished. And now, he's come back for the last bite. In the quiet village of Umuezi, where the moon shone gently on mud rooftops and owls whispered secrets to trees, something strange happened under a blood-orange sky. Mama Chiamaka, the midwife of 30 years, was helping to deliver twin babies for a young couple, EJ and Obina. The labor was long, full of whispers and sweating prayers, but when the first cry pierced the night, joy turned to dread. Mama Chiamaka stumbled back, her hands trembling, her breath caught between prayer and panic. The newborn's eyes were red, not swollen or sick, but glowing, sharp, unnatural. A second cry followed. Another child, another pair of burning eyes. The hut, once warm with new life, grew cold. Obina rushed in, excitement on his face, but it melted when he saw the color in his children's gaze. "What does this mean?" he asked. Mama Chiamaka didn't answer. She only stepped away, muttering, "I've seen this before, long ago." That night, the village was silent. No ululations of joy, no drums, no naming feast. Instead, doors were shut tightly, and old women knelt by their fires whispering names from the past. One elder wept into her palm. "It has returned," she said. "After all these years." No one dared speak of the old story, the one about how, many seasons ago, the ancestors had sat at a forbidden table, the one set by the devil himself. They had eaten and forgotten, but blood remembers. And now, Red Eyes had returned to remind them. Long before the twins were born, there had been whispers, old enough to be dust, quiet enough to be ignored. The tale was told only in hushed tones, usually when thunder rumbled or owls hooted thrice. They said that centuries ago, when Umuezi was still young, a great famine struck. Crops failed, goats miscarried, and the river refused fish. The people, starving and desperate, called on the spirits, but none answered. Then one night a stranger came. Tall, smooth-skinned, dressed in fine red robes, he offered a feast like no other. A full table under a silk canopy, lit by fireflies, and filled with meat, fruit, and drink. "Eat," he said, "and live," the chiefs agreed. The elders sat. The people ate until their bellies ached. No one asked who he was. No one asked the price. After the feast, the rains returned. Food grew. But from that day something shifted. The village became suspicious. Secrets multiplied. Shadows stretched longer than they should. And when the stranger vanished, all they found was a black stone beneath the table with markings no one could read. It was buried under the sacred tree and never spoken of again. But the old ones remembered. They had begged the gods to spare their children. It took generations, but now they knew. The devil hadn't forgotten the debt. He had simply waited. The red eyes were not a punishment. They were a receipt, a reminder the children were innocent. But they carried the signature of a promise no one had the courage to undo. Obina named them Kosi and Zina, though few used the names aloud. Most villagers referred to them only as the red-eyed ones, or whispered prayers when they passed. As infants, they were silent watchers, rarely crying, always staring. Their eyes glowed even in dim light, a steady ember that unsettled even the strongest men. By the time they could walk, strange things began to happen. Zina once pointed at a tree and said, "It remembers." And days later, that tree cracked, down the middle during a cloudless noon. Kosi, quiet and slow to speak, drew symbols in the dirt that matched the carvings on the buried stone, though he had never seen it. Chickens refused to cross their path. Dogs whined when they neared. Children who tried to play with them returned home with odd dreams and couldn't explain why they cried in their sleep. EJ, their mother, tried to pretend they were normal. She dressed them in white, braided their hair with cowries, and made them recite verses from the Book of Protection. But the village watched from a distance. Even their laughter, light and musical, sounded wrong, echoing too long, like it belonged to a place beneath the earth. One night, EJ found Kosi standing, at the edge of the compound, staring at the moon. "He's waiting," he whispered. "He wants to eat again." That night, she locked the door and burned bitter leaf. But the scent of roasted yam filled the air, though no one was cooking. The devil, it seemed, was hungry once more. In the outskirts of Umuezi lived Reby, the oldest man in the region. They said he had outlived 3 chiefs and once wrestled a storm into silence. Blind in one eye, half-crippled, he rarely spoke. But when the red-eyed twins were born, he began to mutter in his sleep. "The table," he groaned. "Don't sit again." His granddaughter Amara told no one, thinking it was just age. But then he began to speak in a language she didn't know. One night, after days of fever and murmuring, he awoke screaming, "They've returned! They've come wearing the blood of our greed!" The next morning he demanded to be taken to the sacred tree. Though brittle and frail, he stood before the old bark and knelt, pressing his palm to the ground. "We buried it here," he whispered. "But the stone breathes, it calls, and the children hear it." That evening, Amara found him carving, a small figure from charcoal, 2 tiny forms with glowing red seeds for eyes. He placed them at his doorstep and sprinkled ash over them. "Protection," he said, "or maybe an apology." Reby spoke again in the village square the next day for the first time in years. "We ate what was not ours. We fed where spirits starved. And now the blood we passed down bears their hunger." Many laughed. Some crossed themselves. But others, especially the oldest ones, stood still. They had seen the twins. They knew the truth in his voice. The devil never forgets his banquet guests. By the twins' 6th year, the village could no longer pretend. Kosi had always been the quieter one, observing more than speaking. But one dawn, he stood outside his hut, barefoot in the dew, and whispered into the earth. "It's beneath us," he said to no one. "The mouth is still open." Birds that had been singing moments before went silent. When EJ tried to scold him, her voice cracked mid-sentence. That same day, a strange fog crept through Umuezi. Not misty or cold, but thick and sweet-smelling, like roasted fruit turning sour. People covered their mouths, but it clung to them like damp cloth. At the river, fish floated to the surface with red streaks in their eyes. That night, Kosi sat by the fire and told his mother, "He's asking for a name." EJ wept quietly. Obinna, who had long stopped arguing with the strange events, simply stared into the flames. But Kosi wasn't done. "He says the debt wasn't just hunger, it was trust. And we broke it." Then the boy touched the flame. It didn't burn him. It clung to his fingers like wax. Mama Chimaka, who had come to visit, dropped her bowl and whispered, "It has begun again." The village held a council that night, but none could agree what to do. They had no priest strong enough to undo what was already inside the blood. And Kosi, with fire dancing on his palm, simply looked at them through eyes redder than ever, and smiled. Reby had once warned that the black stone beneath the sacred tree breathes in seasons, but now it exhaled. It began the morning after Kosi's strange fire display. Farmers near the sacred tree reported a bitter smell in the soil. Goats refused to graze there. One child claimed to hear humming beneath the earth. The villagers dug in secret under the cover of darkness, using wooden tools and muttered prayers. After 2 feet they found it, black, smooth, humming faintly like a trapped beehive. The stone was warm to the touch, and a red mark pulsed at its center like a heartbeat. The men who touched it bled from their fingertips. They buried it again, deeper this time, and scattered ashes over the ground. But the tree above it began to wilt, not die, just bend, as though bowing to something old. The next day, a strange mark appeared on Zena's back, circular, sharp-lined, and glowing. EJ tried to scrub it with bitter leaf. It only grew brighter. That night, she awoke to find Zena standing by the window, staring into the forest. "He knows where it is," she said, eyes unblinking. "He's just waiting for the last name to be spoken." No one knew what the last name meant. But Reby, when he heard it, collapsed. "The table had one empty chair," he murmured. "One soul never ate. The devil always comes back to finish the meal. The village was no longer asking if something was wrong. Now they wondered when the feast would begin again. The rains had come on time, the yams had grown fat, and the cassava leaves shimmered with health, but everything tasted wrong. At first, people blamed the soil, then the water, then their own tongues. But the salt wasn't the seasoning kind. It was the taste of blood clotting on teeth, of secrets left too long in the sun. Mothers noticed their children spitting out bites they once loved. Men chewed in silence and swallowed with shame. Something had changed in the food. Then came the dreams. Almost every household reported them. Fires that burned sideways, mouths with too many teeth, a table stretching endlessly through the sky, and at the center 2 chairs, both occupied by children with red eyes. One man, a palm wine tapper, tried to bless his harvest with prayer. When he drank the first gourd, his tongue swelled, and he collapsed in spasms. He survived, but his speech never returned. The elders gathered and agreed to offer a sacrifice. A goat was taken to the river, but before it could be slain, it broke its rope and ran into the forest, never to return. "The land is rejecting," Mama Chimaka said. "It's not the offering, it's the debt." And yet, no one knew how to pay a debt signed in hunger, sealed in red eyes. EJ stayed inside now, feeding her twins only fruits from her own garden. But even those began to smell of iron. The feast had begun long ago, and it was still eating. The drummers of Umuezi were sacred men, trained to summon joy, memory, or silence with each beat. But now, their drums betrayed them. During the New Moon Festival, when the village gathered under lanterns, the lead drummer's hand froze mid-rhythm. He swore the drum throbbed on its own. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a low groan that made knees buckle and stomachs twist. The villagers paused. Children clung to their mothers. The drummer dropped his stick. "It's beneath us," he said. "It's always been beneath us." That night, the sacred drum was sealed in the shrine. But the beat didn't stop. At midnight, faint thumping echoed from the ground, slow, patient, like breath drawn in reverse. Even the birds refused to sing. Zina began humming in her sleep, matching the rhythm exactly. Kosi drew circles with ash outside the hut, eyes closed, as if guided by memory not his own. "He's not angry," he said when asked. "He's hungry. That's worse." The people started to cover their mirrors. Reflections lingered too long. Shadows moved before bodies did. One girl saw her own face smile before her mouth moved. "The devil," they said, "doesn't knock twice. He enters through sound, memory, and children." The next morning, the sacred drum split in 2 without being touched. From its center, a faint line of smoke rose and curled toward the direction of the buried stone. And in that moment, the elders knew. The devil was not returning. He was already listening. He arrived just before sunset, tall, skin like polished bark, wearing a dark red wrapper without dust. No one saw him enter from the forest path. He was simply there, standing beside the shrine, unmoving. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. But people felt him. The children grew quiet. Chickens scattered. The air changed. When asked for his aim, he smiled slightly. "I came for the table." That night, Obina found Kosi sitting at the hearth, speaking to no one. "He's watching now. He's wearing a man's face, but it's not his." Mama Chiamaka, who had seen too much to doubt, gathered the elders. But the stranger had already begun moving from compound to compound, never speaking unless asked, always smiling with perfect teeth that somehow looked borrowed. At the well, he drew water that refused to ripple. At the market, he touched yams that turned soft by morning. No one stopped him. One man tried to offer him a gift, a dried fish wrapped in leaf. The stranger only sniffed it and whispered, "Still not enough." That night, the village dog howled until its throat cracked. EJ barred the doors and held her children close. "He's not walking," Zina whispered. "He's floating." The next morning, the stranger was gone, but his footprints burned into the earth remained, glowing faintly like embers. The devil doesn't always come in fire. Sometimes he comes wearing sandals, smiling like an uncle. And when he asks for the table, what he really wants is the last one who hasn't eaten yet. Among the youngest in the village was Nena, a mute child barely 5. She had never spoken a word since birth, never cried, never whimpered. But after the stranger arrived, she began to hum. Not tunes, taught by her mother or heard from other children, but something older, deeper, like a melody from the time when trees first listened. She started drawing spirals on the walls using charcoal, and one morning, she scrawled a picture that made the elders gasp. It was the table. Not just a table, but the table. Long, floating above the ground, surrounded by faceless guests, with a single red-robed figure at its head. The last seat was empty. Nena pointed at the empty chair, then tapped her chest, twice. That evening the picture disappeared. The mud wall where she'd drawn it was smooth again, like freshly built. But that night, Nena spoke for the first time. Her voice cracked like wood splitting. "He wants me to eat." Her mother fainted. The villagers carried her to Dibia Uba, who stared into the girl's eyes for what felt like hours. Then he said, "It's not just the twins. The hunger has spread." The devil's hunger was not for food. It was for participation, for someone willing to accept his offering and seal the story full circle. Nena, small and silent for so long, was now the one the feast waited for. Because she had never denied the invitation. She had simply been born remembering it. And now the final bite approached. No one called for a festival, no drums were played. But the table still appeared. It wasn't built by hands. It grew from the soil, long, black, and polished like obsidian. By the next morning, it stood in the center of Umuezi, as if it had always been there. On it were no plates, but red cloths and silver goblets filled with dark liquid that smelled like roasted palm nuts and something metallic. No one dared approach, yet it pulled at them. The elders knelt and chanted, trying to bind the table with prayer. Nothing changed. The twins stood near it, their eyes pulsing faintly. "We've been here before," Kosi said. "It feels like home." Zena nodded. "But it's not ours." That evening, Nena walked to the table barefoot. No one stopped her. Her mother screamed, but her voice froze in the air. The girl climbed into the empty seat and stared at the goblet before her. The village held its breath. The devil never appeared, not in form, but the shadows beneath the table grew longer, then darker, curling like smoke. Nena lifted the cup, but before she could drink, Kosi placed his hand over hers. "Let's not finish what they started," he said. The goblet shattered. Wind howled. The sky went black for 7 heartbeats. Then silence. When the light returned, the table was gone. But so was Nena. The twins stood alone. Their eyes no longer glowed. The devil's table had vanished, but it had tasted just enough to sleep again. The village never saw Nena again. Some said she was taken. Others said she walked into a world they could no longer see. But after the night the table vanished, something shifted. The fog that had clung to the village cleared. The yams stopped tasting like salt. Chickens laid eggs again. The red in the twins' eyes faded until only a faint ring remained. A memory, not a warning. Dibia Uba passed away quietly in his sleep 3 nights later, a faint smile on his face. "The meal has ended," he whispered as his last words. The sacred tree began to bloom again, its branches stretching wide as if exhaling. But beneath it, the earth remained warm. Obina dug where the stone had once been and found nothing, just soft soil and the scent of smoke. EJ began planting bitterleaf again, and it grew without grief. Yet none forgot what had happened. Mirrors were still covered at night. Children were taught to bless their mouths before meals, and in the school they built beside the old shrine, one seat remained empty. No one was assigned to it, but sometimes a breeze would move its stool, and chalk would roll across the floor. The devil had not been defeated. He had simply been acknowledged. And that, the elders said, was the secret. You do not fight him with fire or sword. You survive him by remembering. The table may return, the hunger may stir. But when it does, Umuezi will no longer eat in silence. Months passed, and Umuezi looked almost normal again. Crops flourished, drums returned to rhythm. The elders smiled more often, but deep inside the air, something still pulsed. One evening, a group of young boys tried to burn a broken drum that had been tainted during the curse months. They set it in the village center, surrounded it with dry grass and lit a fire. The flames leapt, then stopped, frozen mid-breath. The grass blackened but did not burn. Smoke curled backward, down instead of up. The boys screamed and fled. The drum remained untouched, and in the center of its surface, a small symbol appeared, etched in soot, a spiral identical to the ones Nena used to draw. Mama Chiamaka saw it first. She wept. "It's not over," she whispered. "We only paused it." That night, the sacred fire in the shrine flickered blue. The village's night guard reported hearing humming, not human, not wind, but something between them. And Kosi. He dreamed of the table again. But this time it was empty. No food, no goblets, just chairs. Hundreds of them. All waiting. He told Zina. She only said, "The hunger never leaves, it just moves." The next day, someone found the blackened drum split in half, clean, as if by blade. And beneath it, fresh footprints. Bare, small, pointing toward the forest. The fire had refused to destroy what remembered. Because memory, like spirits, survives the flames we offer. And in Umuezi, memories now walked barefoot. It began with whispers, barely noticed, like the rustle of dry banana leaves. But soon, everyone heard them. The wind started speaking, not in full sentences but names. Old ones, forgotten ones, dead ones. The names of ancestors who had sat at the devil's table generations ago. The first to notice was an old woman who'd lost her hearing years before. She began laughing at nothing, sitting beneath the sacred tree and pointing at shadows. "They're back," she cried. "They want their names remembered." Others dismissed her, until the wind passed through the marketplace one hot afternoon, and carried the voice of a man dead 30 years. "I paid with silence," it said. "Now you will pay with echoes." That night, the wind howled like a choir. Mothers held their children close. Elders circled the tree, reciting every name they could remember, hoping to calm whatever was stirring. Kosi stood by his window, listening. "They're lonely," he said. "Not angry, just forgotten." Zina began etching names into stones and leaving them at the base of the sacred tree. The wind softened for 3 nights. Then came a boy, barely 3, who screamed during his nap. When asked what he saw, he said, "The table again. But this time it had my name on it." That night, no one slept. In Umuezi, even the breeze carried history, and history had found its voice. The devil's hunger wasn't just for food. It was for erasure, to consume not just lives, but lineage. And now, that silence was being spoken back into the wind. In the village of Umuezi, forgetting had always been safer, but now, remembrance itself began to hurt. Zina woke up with black markings on her palms, strange loops and lines. They matched the etchings she had left at the sacred tree. The herbalist, trying to cleanse her hands with salt water, found his own eyes turned red for hours. He covered every mirror in his hut. Others began to suffer too. A man who spoke an ancestor's name too many times began stuttering uncontrollably. A girl who sang an old funeral song began coughing ash. Dibia Uba's old scrolls, locked in the shrine for decades, burst open one night and revealed new lines not written by any living hand. "Memory has weight," one line read. "Too much and the spine breaks." Mama Chimaka warned the Yu, elders. "We buried truth for a reason. Some ghosts prefer quiet." But Kosi disagreed. "It's not ghosts. It's guilt." He started teaching the village children the names they were never meant to know. Zina wrote them in chalk on the schoolhouse walls. At first, parents wiped them off. But they always returned by dawn, written more neatly each time. Remembering had become both a weapon and a shield. And the devil? He hadn't returned because he didn't need to. The village was doing his work now, fighting over what to forget and what to keep. And somewhere beneath the sacred tree, the buried stone pulsed softly again, like a drum waiting to be struck just once more. It was Xena who found it. One dawn she knelt by the sacred tree, pressing her ear to the ground, searching for silence. But what she heard was breath, slow, steady, rhythmic. She dug, fingers clawing through soil and memory. A foot deep, she found a bone. Not human, not animal. It was smooth and black, warm to the touch, and pulsing faintly. She touched it and heard a name in her mind. Nenna. Her name hadn't been spoken in months. Not since the night of the table. And yet, the ground still remembered. She ran to Kosi. Together they uncovered more, bits of ash, a twisted silver thread, something that looked like an old tooth wrapped in hair. Relics not buried, but preserved. A priest was summoned. He refused to enter the clearing. "This is a womb," he said, "and it's not done birthing." That night the earth cracked slightly beneath the sacred tree. A soft hum, low and melodic, echoed for miles. Mothers clutched their babies. Fires burned blue again, but no one moved to flee. The villagers stood side by side, waiting for whatever would come. Kosi whispered, "If it's her." "She's not. Angry." Xena lit a single lantern and placed it over the bone. "She's just coming back to finish the story." The earth stilled, the tree swayed once, and in the distance, thunder rolled, not loud, but slow, like a chair being pulled out at the end of a long table. Nenna's name had returned, and so, it seemed, had she. Dawn came without color. The sky over Umuezi turned silver, thick, and flat, like hammered metal. Birds were gone. Roosters crowed, but the sound echoed too long, as though lost in time. The village stood still, caught between breath and memory. At the center of it all, the sacred tree stood like a sentinel, bent but unbroken. Beneath it, the ground cracked open wider, revealing not a hole but a spiral staircase made of roots and ash. Kosi and Xena stood at the top, holding hands. "It's time," Xena whispered, "to return what was taken." No one stopped them. The villagers gathered around silently, old and young, afraid and faithful. The children led the descent. Terrain, they walked downward, the light above dimmed, but a faint red glow flickered from beneath. At the bottom, they found it. The table. Not imagined, not summoned, real. Half-eaten fruits, goblets still full, chairs occupied by shadows that shimmered with faces no one remembered, yet felt deep in their bones. At the head sat Nenna, not dead, not aged, waiting. "Are you ready to speak the truth?" she asked. Kosi nodded. Together, he and Xena stepped forward and placed their hands on the table. "We are not the ones who ate," Kosi said, "but we are the ones who remember." Nenna smiled. "Then the table has no more power." And just like that, it cracked down the middle. The chairs crumbled, the feast turned to dust, and from that dust, seeds rose into light. The twins returned from beneath the tree at sunset, but they were not the same. Their eyes no longer glowed, but they held depth, a depth that remembered. In their palms, they carried seeds, 6 each, tiny black seeds with red veins that pulsed faintly as if alive. They walked to the center of Umuezi and planted them in a perfect circle. The villagers watched in silence. The wind picked up slightly, warm and low, like breath through a flute. Then the children began to speak. Not in words, but in names. They whispered the names of ancestors who had sat at the forbidden table, names long buried in shame. With each name spoken, a seed pulsed. The soil shifted, cracked and closed again, burying the memory not in fear, but in purpose. Mama Chiamaka wept openly. "We are planting what we should have faced generations ago," she said. Now the ground can carry it. The circle of seeds was surrounded with stones, not as a prison, but as a promise. If we forget again, Xena said, they'll grow. The villagers nodded. Memory had been cursed because it was hidden. Now it was sacred because it was shared. The tree above them stretched higher. Its roots curled into the seed circle like an elder folding arms around a child. For the first time in generations, the land of Umuezi did not carry silence. It carried story. And that story had names, faces, blood, and now, forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. No one in Umuezi feared meals anymore. But they approached food differently. Before every bite they said a name, not of a god or a spirit, but of an ancestor. They remembered. They blessed the hungry who came before them and warned the young never to eat what was not meant for them. The twins, now symbols of balance, were invited to every ceremony, every wedding, every burial. But they never ate. Not in public. Not during rituals. We ate once, Kosi said quietly. Not with our mouths, but with our blood. Xena added, we carry the meal still. We don't need to taste it again. The people understood. Children grew up learning the story. Not as a legend, but as lineage, and the spiral that once haunted their dreams was now etched into their clothing, their clay pots, their gates, not as a curse, but a reminder. When a traveler asked the village chief why the children with red eyes never ate with others, the chief simply smiled. Because some hunger, he said, was never meant to be filled. That night, thunder rolled in the distance, but the people did not run. They placed their bowls outside, letting the rain wash over them, cleansing, reverent, and when the lightning struck near the sacred tree, it didn't burn. It carved a new line into the bark, a spiral, surrounded by 12 stars. The tree stood, tall. The seeds remained, and silence once feared had become a sacred pause. Years later, travelers still came to Umuezi, not for riches or trade, but for the story. They came with questions about the children with red eyes, the table that once appeared from the earth, and the girl named Nena, who disappeared into myth. The villagers welcomed them, but before they spoke, they always led visitors to the seed circle. There, a young boy or girl would tell the tale, not with fear but with strength. They would speak of how hunger made men forget, and how silence nearly consumed a village. But they would always end with one truth. We remembered, and we planted what we once tried to bury. The devil, they said, no longer haunted Umuezi, because the devil feeds on what we hide, and Umuezi no longer hides. Kosi and Xena grew older, never leaving, always watching. The red in their eyes faded completely, but their gaze never lost its depth. Nena's name became a festival, held every year beneath the blooming sacred tree. Drums played, mirrors remained uncovered, fires burned true, and beneath it all, the soil pulsed, no longer with warnings, but with wisdom. The village thrived. The story spread. And far beyond the borders of Umuezi, others whispered of the place where red-eyed children once stood between a curse and a future, where a table vanished into dust, where silence gave way to seed. And so, the story of the children, born with red eyes, became the story of a village that learned to love the unseen. And that, they say, is the most powerful story of all. We hope you enjoyed today's story. Give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. That's all for today. We see you in the next story. Till then, take care, folks.